I'm Aubrey Sitterson, and this is SKALD. You're listening to the only story that matters. Every episode is written by me. Every episode is recorded by me, and I do it all in one single, flawless take. This is the first episode of SKALD's sixth cycle, which means that it's a particularly good place to dive in. After you've been hooked by this episode, you can go back and check out the previous 80, or pick up the prose volumes available exclusively on Amazon. This isn't me reading you a story. This is me telling you a story. This is SKALD, part 81. The brute, the savage, the monster looked frantically around the room, searching for something to break, to smash, to demolish, to destroy. With an unhinged wildness in his one good eye, the other ruined and gone white from a long, angry scar, he looked upon the room's inhabitants, knowing his rage, knowing his hate and his antipathy, knowing them all intimately, but knowing not where to direct them. He looked first upon the Burman prince, looked with disdain upon his naked, exhausted, unconscious form. Then he looked up. He looked to Ho, to Master Ho, to the bound and terrified old man who sat shivering involuntarily against the wall. And then, finally, the destroyer. He laid his single angry eye upon her, the elf, the high elf, the ambassador, Harana. He saw her standing in the doorway, watching lasciviously as the powers she knew, the powers she wielded, the powers she had bestowed upon the vermin prince as they came to fruition, as they called forth this heaving, violent monstrosity. The moment that the brute saw her, the instant that his eye focused upon her lithe, statuesque form, a hateful roar began to build within him. It was a sound that began in the pit of his bowels, that rumbled up unbidden, rattling every single one of his vital organs, until they too began to join in that rage-filled cry, shaking and vibrating, a cacophonous racket that exploded out of the savage's gaping maw, even as he leapt into action. He was disconcertingly fast. He was impossibly quick. He possessed a speed belied by his bulky frame, by the paunch he wore proudly, like something he had grown himself. But though he had surely reached middle age, though his hair was streaked with gray, though his skin was worn and wrinkled, baked by decades of flame and smoke, though he had been taken and battered by age, it had done nothing to slow him. So fast was the savage that the high elf, with her preternatural quickness, with her nimble feet and dancing motions, so speedily did he charge down upon her that she only narrowly escaped. She slipped out the door. She escaped from that nightmarish chamber, that hidden temple and its now decimated altar of filth. She escaped from that room and its rotten pink smoke, from its stench of decay. She scurried out into the hallway, the one stained with jaundiced light, and he, the savage, the brute, he would have followed, he would have given chase if they hadn't stopped him. Crowding into the room, filling the vacuum left by Harana, they stepped forward upon spindly legs and filth-covered paws. They gazed out through eyes that were deadened, through eyes that were multitudes. They gnashed their teeth and they sharpened their claws upon the stones. They rushed forward, ready to do as they had been commanded, to subdue this mysterious, truculent creature, to oppress him into the service of their master, the Vermin Prince. The one in front, the one who fancied himself their leader, the commander of that disorganized rabble, the one with the mouth most approaching human, one not so given over to teeth and to mandibles and to bloated tongues that he couldn't still speak in human language. That's exactly what he did. Exactly what he tried to do. He attempted to call out. He raised his hand and attempted to give an order, to give a command, not knowing that the one he hailed, the one he spoke to, would die before he obeyed. Before the order was completed, before it was even spoke, the brute, the savage, the destroyer lashed out. He shot out an overhanded swing, clumsy and ill-considered, but precision, calculated strikes, tactics, they are all unnecessary. They are all unimportant. They are all pointless when one is driven, is motivated, is fueled, is filled by unspeakable rage. And thus, the roaring of the destroyer, that unintelligible wailing, it was joined by two sounds. The opening strains of a command, of an order. The dull, sickening thud that put a stop to it. The sound of the leader's head meeting the hard, unforgiving, blackened wood of the destroyer's heavy, inelegant cudgel. Before the leader's body had even hit the ground, before his cracked skull bounced off the stones, spilling its contents out into the filth like a rotted melon, his followers, his comrades, they leapt into action, crawling over their leader in a desperate attempt to get to their target, to their destroyer. They leapt upon him, they grasped at his limbs, and they succeeded. They succeeded in restraining that arm, that most important arm, the one that wielded that bloody, notched cudgel. They pinned it to the savage's body in the midst of its follow-through. They pushed him back. They forced him away from the door, eager to keep the destroyer's unspeakable violence, to keep his terrifying bloodlust contained within that horrible room. He struggled to maintain his footing, fighting to stay upright while assaulted by those clenching fists and their filthy claws, struggling to stay standing under slaps and punches and the crushing weight that comes with a swarm of vermin. Though they succeeded in neutralizing his cudgel and the arm that held it, though they held him back from the door, protecting Harana's retreat, though they clambered on top of him, gaining leverage, battering him from above, it wasn't enough. It wasn't sufficient. It wasn't near enough to stop him, to halt a savage with nothing to lose, a brute with everything to gain, an oaf with every reason to hate and despise all those who stood before him. They could not stop a destroyer. Because though they had pinned his arm to his body, though they had protected themselves from any future wild, violent swings of the cudgel, the brute, the savage, he was far from defenseless. Where other men, where lesser men would have simply accepted their fate, would have allowed themselves to become overrun by the swarm, by the horde, by that wave of disgusting vermin, the destroyer refused. And what's more, he refused to take a knee to anyone. So he stood. He remained standing. He held his ground. He thrashed and he flailed. He headbutted and he elbowed. He threw elbows and the knees that he refused to place upon the ground. It was a shocking display of violence, a maelstrom of destruction, one that left even Master Ho in awe, stunned by the simple, brutish brutality of the destroyer's motions, as different as they were from his 8-arm technique, as devoid of artistry and of joy. He still saw something familiar in them. Soon enough, the destroyer's arm was freed. He had not full motion, but motion enough. Room enough, space enough to begin to swing his cudgel in wide, erratic arcs. He had room enough to clear more room, and before long he had room enough to begin his slaughter in earnest, with fire flashing in his one good eye, with his one bad eye reflecting that undeniable flame. The savage set about his grisly, brutal work, smashing his cudgel down again and again on anyone brave enough, on anyone foolish enough to come within his reach. The destroyer was drenched in blood, some his own and some that foul ichor that flowed through his assailants. He was coated in gore, his hardened, leathery skin crisscrossed with scratches, with gouges, and with wounds. He was a nightmarish apparition, a frightening reminder of man's true origins, of what enabled his ancestors to pull themselves out of the primordial muck, what allowed them to set themselves up on high and request, no, and demand what they wanted, what they deserved. But the most terrible, the most horrible, the most abhorrent thing about him was that smile. No, not a smile. A grin, a rictus grin, a horrible mockery of joy, a mockery of life itself, a grin that was plastered upon his face, twisting his chapped, split lips up into unnatural positions. His teeth flashed, an unnaturally, impossibly white beacon amongst the gore and the viscera. Somewhere along the way, the destroyer's pained howling had become something else, something far, far more terrible. It was a song of joy, a song of ecstasy, a song of release and of triumph, one that he belted out with every bit of air in his lungs as he set about beating the breath from all those who opposed him. Again And again the cudgel came down, cracking the arms thrown up in futile defense, smashing skulls and cracking them open, exposing the fevered brains within to the noxious pink smoke that still swirled about the room, pouring continuously out of those iron thuribles. He struck again and again, heedless of the monsters that continued to pour into the room, that continued to scratch, to bite, and to claw. He brought the cudgel down again and again, because once it wasn't enough. It was never enough. It wasn't enough to simply bat the monsters away. No, he needed to batter them into the earth, to grind them into the dust from whence they came. And so he did. That's exactly what he did. He lowered that heavy, blackened chunk of wood again and again and again. Though more monsters continued to swarm around him, though they increased their number, though Ho could see that he would soon be overwhelmed, the destroyer was not deterred. As the swarm clawed at him, as they ripped open his flesh, as they reached up in hopeless attempts to gouge out his one remaining good eye, he struck down again and again, beating whatever monster was still breathing, whatever monster was still twitching, whatever monster still had an ounce of life left in them, beating them down until there was nothing left at all. Again and again, the cudgel came down until one monster, one debased and debauched creature, one filth-covered, disgusting wretch had the audacity, had the temerity, had the impudence to reach up, not intentionally, no, because nothing that poor, forgotten soul did at that point was intentional. His senses had departed, and his life was about to do the same, but instinctively his hand shot up and it reached out. His twisted, gnarled fingers, covered in oozing barbs and grayed claws, they reached upward and they grasped it. They touched it. They made to steal it, to take what wasn't theirs. That poor, dying abomination laid its hands upon the horn. That long, twisting, alabaster horn. And when it happened, when the dying creature placed its hands upon the horn, when the destroyer saw it place its hands upon the horn, all joy, all sadistic glee, all violent, hateful, cathartic pleasure abandoned his face. The song of destructive bliss came to an abrupt end, and another gut-shaking roar emanated from the savage as he began to rain down blows faster and faster, swinging not only with his cudgel, but with the horn itself. He tore it from the creature's hands. He tore it from the simple leather strap that tied it to his neck, and he drove it down again and again, again and again, plunging it into the bloated, pus-filled flesh of that endless swarm. The destroyer clubbed, and he cut, he stabbed and battered, he executed and murdered everything within range. But still, it wasn't enough. They kept coming, those corrupted and transformed, those defiled and transmogrified by the vermin prince's magics. They, a never-ending horde, issued forth from that jaundiced light, and they marched directly into death, willingly, eager to serve their master, to serve the vermin prince until the bitter, merciful end. Suddenly, something changed. The swarm marched forward, marched toward the destroyer, not with a sense of joy, but with a sense fear. They fought each other not to get somewhere, but to get away from somewhere, to get away from something. Their fear of the brute's savage blows could not contend with their fear of what was behind them, of what pushed them forward, of what filled the hallway, blocking out that jaundiced light, of what then filled the doorway, resting upon too many legs with too many joints. It sat there, heaving, breathing heavily through its slavering jaws. With its useless webbed wings fluttering behind it, the creature drove its withered, flabby body forward upon those long, spindly legs, and as it came into the light, Ho gasped. Though he had seen things too horrible to speak of, too horrible to recount, too horrible to remember or forget, this was beyond the pale, because now, backlit by that nauseating yellow, freed from the darkness where he last laid eyes upon it, standing there with that noxious pink smoke swirling between its twitching legs, it was what used to be a man, what used to be something natural, but now was something more and something less, and more than anything, it was something horrible. It was Garn. If what Garn had become could speak. It didn't. But Ho wouldn't have been surprised if it couldn't. If that all-too-human ability, if that which separated man from the beasts had itself been separated from Garn. If in receiving the Vermin Prince's peerless gifts, if in allowing himself to be transformed and debased, if in watching as his once human jaws were transformed into venom-coated mandibles, if the man who was once Garn, if the creature who was once Garn, if he had lost his speech entirely. But now, in his new form, in this horrifying state, either evolved or devolved, Garn didn't need speech. He didn't need language, because he spoke through two things and two things alone: fear and force. The rest of that swarm, the rest of the Vermin Prince's countless followers, they knew fear. They knew it intimately. They were filled with it as they felt Garn's hot breath upon their necks, and they soon met his force. They soon became well acquainted with his power as those long, bristle-covered legs shot out, clearing the monster's path. Some were simply knocked aside, limbs broken, skulls crushed by the blows of that horrible creature, by the legs that, though thin and knobby, still contained some horrible eldritch strength. And those were the luckiest. Those were the most fortunate, as those that didn't get knocked aside, those that didn't survive with only a broken limb, those who didn't meet a quick death from a blow to the head. They had to contend with those terrible jaws. As Garn's long, abominable legs shot out again and again, his jaws too set to work, snapping and tearing. But they didn't intend to eat. No, Garn had already sated his hunger, a fact that Ho shuddered to remember. Now, Garn bit not to feed, but to kill slowly, but to inflict unspeakable, unending suffering upon his victims. As those slavering jaws clamped shut again and again, as those impossible mandibles clacked together again and again, their sharp, barbed edges cut and infected, they sliced and they infested. Every time they closed, every time they so much as brushed up against flesh, they corrupted and they killed, but not quickly. No, that would have been too easy. The venom on those mandibles was quick acting, but slow killing, so that those infected, those touched, could do naught but fall down, frozen, eyes propped open as they were consumed by a yawning abyss of misery, a sucking void of agony so deep, so terrible, so intense that it seemed to stretch time itself. A pain so acute that it pierced its victims' very souls. It made them offer up all they had, all they would ever have, made them plead for an eternity in flames, for anything, if only that horrendous torment would come to a merciful end. Garn tore through what remained of the swarm, plowing forward, forging ahead, forcing his fellow devotees, the servants of the vermin prince, driving them into that whirling maelstrom of violence, into the swinging arms, into the blackened cudgel, into that long, twisting alabaster horn, into the blood-drenched horror that once again began to scream in a tone that sounded disconcertingly like glee. The swarm was caught, was trapped, was surrounded on all sides by Garn and his terrible legs, by Garn and his far, far worse venom, by the corpses of their fellows, by the poisoned forms of their less lucky brethren, by that flashing white horn, by that crushing black branch, and worst of all, by that horrible, terrifying, gleaming rictus grin. Like a hammer upon an anvil, they clashed again and again, and the sparks they emitted blinded Ho, forcing him to turn away, to search for a brief respite from that horrible carnage, from the charnel house that the still unconscious vermin prince's altar room had become. And when Ho looked back, when he forced himself to gaze out through the pink smoke, through the horrible red mist, through the rivulets of blood that had splattered him as the butchers went about their horrible work in that grisly abattoir, he saw what remained. He saw the most terrible monster to be found there, to be found in a labyrinth teeming with horrors. Garn hunched over, his mandibles spread wide, his legs twitching, eager for action, eager to mete out death. He hunched over and he looked down at that brute, that savage, that oaf, that destroyer, the one who raised his chin, casting back his gray-streaked hair, matted with blood and with gore, flinging it back, the better to lift his head to the heavens that had forgotten him, that had forsaken him, to raise his head, to clench his eyes shut and laugh. Thanks for checking out this, the best episode of SKALD yet. This show is completely DIY, which means that the marketing budget for it is non-existent. That's why reviews of the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher, and of the prose volumes on Amazon, that's why they are so very important. They are the absolute best way to get SKALD in front of new audiences. Plus, if you write a good review, I'll read it right here on the show. The inquiring empiricist says, one of my favorite podcasts. SKALD is truly exemplary, featuring a modern-day Scandinavian bard telling gritty, thrilling, mind-bending fantasy stories completely without editing or assistance. SKALD is certainly worth your time to listen to it, as it will fill your waking hours with legends of mighty barbarians and untold magics. I am not a mega famous dude with legions of supporters. I am not independently wealthy. I am not part of some big podcast network. I'm just one guy telling one story, chapter by chapter, week by week. And to keep doing that, I need the support of people like you, the smart, generous, thoughtful people who listen to the only story that matters. The people who understand that I put a significant amount of time into this thing each and every week. To help support the show, to pitch a few bucks into the hat each month, head to patreon.com/skald today. If you want more information on me or any of my many projects, including SKALD, my wrestling talk show Straight Shoot, and my work on the G.I. Joe comics for IDW, head to aubreysitterson.com. You can also find me on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and Tumblr. I am Aubrey Sitterson everywhere. Finally, my weekly recommendation. By the time you hear this, it'll already be out. It'll be available everywhere. It's Every Time I Die's Low Teens. It's their newest album, and my pal, Andy Williams, sent me an early copy of it. I'm totally biased. I love Andy. He's an awesome dude. He's been on my wrestling talk show before, and I love hanging out with him. But here's the thing. Completely unbiased, this is Every Time I Die's best album ever. It is amazing. If you're not already familiar with Buffalo's own Every Time I Die, now is the time to fix that with Low Teens. It is heavy and it rips. It is like stampeding dinosaur music. It's amazing. Check it out ASAP. Low Teens by Buffalo's own Every Time I Die. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next week.